Hey friends, welcome back. You often hear about fancy new CSS features, but when you want to use them, well, they're often still experimental and only supported in certain browsers. Nothing you can really use without polyfills, etc. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to 11 of the latest CSS and HTML features that you can actually use. They're all so-called baseline features, meaning Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari and mobile browsers are supported, so you can use them in good conscience. And if you watch this video all the way to the end, you won't just learn about some new, really useful features. You'll also learn what CSS Houdini is about. You'll find out how to make your page render more efficiently, which has particular benefits on smartphones, and you'll understand why, now at the latest, it's finally no longer a challenge to vertically center an HTML element, even without using grid or flex. Let's get started. A staple of UI design for years now, dark mode. If you're releasing a new modern app and care about a cool UX, you can hardly avoid it. For years, there have been ongoing additions in JavaScript and CSS on how to enable dark mode and, above all, respect the user's color scheme. You can use media queries for that, but they come with downsides in readability if you think of very complex files and verbosity. But there's a neat new shorthand for it, light dark. You simply pass two color values to this function. If the user's color scheme is light or unknown, the first value is returned. If the user's color scheme is dark, the second is returned. That saves a few lines of code and you can see the setting at a glance. Here, for example, I've specified a light background color for light mode and a dark one for dark mode. And when I change my browser settings accordingly, I get the respective color. Pretty straightforward. Two more notes. For this to work, you need to declare which color schemes are available for which elements, or usually the entire document. Typically, you add a declaration on the root pseudo element, color scheme, light, dark. But it doesn't have to be on root. You could enforce a certain setting only for specific parts of your DOM, if that makes sense for you. One neat trick, since this all works elegantly with CSS, in combination with has, you can implement a color scheme switcher. For example, with a checkbox, when it's checked, the color scheme is always light. A pretty nice, helpful improvement to color management. Light-dark. The Popover API lets you display pop-ups or popovers, whatever you want to call them, natively in the browser without JavaScript. I've already made a dedicated video you can watch here. Back then, I explained that it was supported by all browsers because Google mistakenly announced it in early 2024. However, on mobile, specifically Safari on iOS, there were lingering issues. But in early 2025, this was resolved and you can now use Popover on iPhone. So how does it work? You can simply add the Popover attribute and an ID to any HTML element. It won't be shown at first. To display it, you can give a button a Popover target and put in the ID of the Popover you want to show. With very little overhead and without using JavaScript, you've got a Popover in your app. By default, a Popover closes when you click outside it. And that exact behavior didn't work for a long time in Safari on iOS, which made it unusable for many. That works now. You can also set Popover to manual. Then you need an explicit action to close it again. That can be the same button you used to open it or a dedicated close button, here as an X with Popover target action equals hide. And here's a really nice code pen I found by Arby, where you can see it in action for a chat window that opens on the bottom. Great stuff. By the way, all the code examples are linked below. Most of them on CodePen, but one of the examples was too complex for that, so I hosted it elsewhere. For free. And that's actually thanks to the sponsor of this video, Sevala. Sevala gives you a straightforward, practical platform as a service. You can easily sign up with, for example, GitHub or GitLab and connect your repositories. And for static sites, it's completely free, whether that's plain files or even a static Angular app. Sevala automatically detects the right deployment configuration, and after just a few clicks, you've got a site deployed with automatic deployment on every commit, which I find super convenient. And honestly, it just feels good as a developer. It just works seamlessly. But of course, you're not limited to static sites. You can also host more complex applications. You can use an object storage and a variety of database types, and directly manage schemas and records online through the Database Studio. And another feature I really like are the templates. With them you can automatically deploy entire infrastructures, whether that's a Python MCP server, Laravel, or like I tried here, Firecrawl. With one click, it deploys the Redis, the Playwright service and the API super easy. As I said, static content is free. For everything else, Sevala has a very transparent, usage-based pricing model with no artificial limits. For example, you can invite unlimited collaborators. You don't have to pay per seat. You just pay based on what you actually use, and I think that's just fair. And on top of that, you get $50 in free credits to start. So give it a try. I can really recommend it. You'll find the link in the video description. Let's keep going. If you don't just, stick to preset colors from Material or Tailwind, etc., but sometimes define your own colors for your web design, this feature might be interesting for you, the relative color syntax. And the name already gives you a pretty good idea. You define a color, any color space works really, and then with simple tweaks you can define a new color based on it that's lighter or darker or more saturated or with more contrast or less, and so on. And I find that super practical because, I don't know about you, but you often have a base color and then need a variation of it, lighter, darker or complementary. And for that you end up specifying a bunch of separate color values that you grab from Photoshop or whatever. But if you later change the base color, you have to manually update all the others. And that's where relative color syntax comes in handy, but from the top. How does it work? First, decide which color space or color function you want to work with. For example, HSL or RGB. There are a few other functions to choose from too. We'll see another in a moment. So let's start with RGB. You write the keyword from and then provide your color, say red. The color you want to derive a relative color from. Then you write R, G and B. Under the hood, it now computes the three values for R, G and B from that red. And those values are exposed as the variables RGB. For red, that's 255, 0, 0. So at first we're only converting from the CSS name color to RGB. We don't have a relative color yet. But because the RGB values are derived dynamically, we can play with them and do math. For example, instead of R, which is 255, I write calc R divided by 2. And the result is a darker red. It now computes R as 127.5, while G and B stay 0. Or I say, take the original R value, but always use 255 for G. In this case, I get yellow. And that may not seem super useful yet, but let's look at this in the OCLab or OKLab, I have no idea how to pronounce it, OCLab color space. We write OKLCH and use the variables L, C and H. L stands for lightness, which is more intuitive to adjust than colors in RGB, at least for me. Then instead of L, I simply use L plus 0.3 and get a lighter tone. And the great thing is, instead of red, I can pass a color in any way I like. For example, as a hex value, like FF0000, or I could use a variable. I've illustrated that in this example. At the top, we have a base color. From that, using only the relative color syntax, we derive a lighter, a darker, and a complementary tone. I could use those perfectly for a theme. And if I change the base color, all the other colors update automatically. Note that I'm using the clamp function to set the upper bound of L, the lightness. In the OCLab color space, it tops out at 1, and otherwise, by adding values, I could end up above 1. That's why I'm using clamp. And you could also use other math functions like min, max, sin, cos, and so on. When we talk about performance optimizations on the web, we often think about bundle sizes and network load times, but other aspects can be optimized too. And one of them is rendering. A modern browser can already render HTML in chunks. It starts before it even has the full document, and it initially paints only the viewport, the part of the page the user can see. Still, it often has to compute styles and layout for off-screen subtrees because they influence the overall document flow, and that costs CPU. With Content Visibility Auto, you can tell the browser which parts of the page belong together and form a self-contained unit. The browser can then skip certain calculations for those elements while they're off-screen. When the user scrolls, they render just in time right before entering the viewport, and that means faster rendering of the initial viewport. I'll say it up front, on a modern desktop machine with lots of power, you usually won't notice much. But this gets interesting on mobile devices, which have weaker CPU CPUs, and the viewport is smaller, so a larger portion of the document sits outside the viewport. Let's look at a demo. We'll exaggerate a bit to make the effect clear. Imagine a blog with a very long list of stories. Here it's 240. We haven't set content visibility. Now we open the Performance tab in the DevTools and throttle the CPU heavily so the effect is obvious. If we reload the page now, performance gets measured and we eventually get the timings, and yeah, here it's nearly 1.2 seconds for rendering. And now we enable Content Visibility Auto. We apply this property to each of those section elements. Every section element represents one story. We then reload the page. And you can immediately see we get a result much faster. With throttling turned on, it's visibly quicker. And the profiling confirms it, 216 milliseconds, a manifold performance boost. Pretty cool. So some will say you could also solve this with infinite scrolling, lazily loading items only when needed. That's true, but depending on the use case, having everything in one document can be better. For example, for accessibility. Even if an element off-screen isn't rendered yet, you can still search for it in the document. Ctrl+F will work, and that's not the case for content that simply isn't there and will be loaded later. One note: for elements where you use Content Visibility Auto, you should also set Contain Intrinsic Size. That's essentially a fallback size. It helps prevent larger layout jumps when the element gets rendered eventually. You know the old challenge. How do you vertically center something in HTML? Well, I started building websites with HTML and CSS about 20 years ago, and getting that to work was nerve-wracking for a long time. So I'm still from an era when people built websites with table elements. So one TD was navigation, one TD the main area, and you could use vertically a line there. Blah. Or you tried for a couple years now to get by with line height hacks. They worked, but that's exactly what they were, hacks. But once Flexbox and later Grid came along, this challenge got a lot easier. You could use align items or justify content, or for multi-line rows, align content to vertically center a container's contents with all clean HTML and CSS. But that then also led to using display grid or display flex in lots of places where you didn't really need a grid or other Flexbox features just to center a single element. But since last year, align content also works on block layout elements as part of the baseline. So if the parent element provides enough space, obviously this one CSS setting is all you need. No catch, super simple. So by now, vertically centering an element really isn't a challenge anymore. The content editable attribute has been available for HTML elements for several years. It has now been expanded again, and this extension only landed in the baseline in March 2025. But back to basics. What does it do? If you want to let your users edit text, you can, well, use a text area. That's convenient, but it comes with limitations. If you've ever tried to dynamically adjust the text area's height to its content, you've probably noticed it's a bit clunky and needs a few hacks. Styling can also be limiting. For example, if you want to highlight only parts of the text with the CSS Custom Highlight API. You could see that here in the example. That doesn't work with text areas. Content editable helps here. It lets you make any element editable with ease. This is especially nice when you switch between a view and an edit state. You don't have to render different DOM elements, div or text area. You can stick with the same element and just toggle the attribute. A long-standing downside of content editable though was that it enabled rich text formatting, and in many cases that's unnecessary and then forces you to build custom scripts and formatting, etc. Now you can give content editable the value plaintext-only. That does exactly what you often need. You enable editing, but only plain text is allowed, no fancy formatting. Ideal for input areas that can grow with their content, no extra overhead. But be aware, if you think about accessibility and correct semantics, a div doesn't magically become a real form control just because it's content editable. With a classic form submit, its content won't be sent. You can add role equals text box to provide the appropriate semantics, but still, it's not the most beautiful HTML, but some might find it acceptable. If you're like me and spent a long time not really knowing what CSS Houdini actually is, this next feature will be interesting. Because I remember thinking back then, okay, is Houdini the next big thing for layout after Flex and Grid? Not exactly. CSS Houdini opens up the CSS engine and exposes APIs. What does it mean in practice? Let's look at property. Property gives you more, let's call it type safety. Nice for hardcore CSS nerds, sure, but it also has very practical benefits. It enables something that wasn't straightforward before, animating gradients. But first things first. CSS variables or custom properties have been standard for ages. If you want to reuse values, you define a variable with 2 dashes. For example, we set a tile value to 200 pixels. That gives tiles a default size. In the tile class, we set width and height to tile. So far, nothing exciting. If you now want the tiles in the highlight row, the first row here, to be larger, you could write width 300 pixels and height 300 pixels on the highlight tile. That works. Or you just set tile to 300 pixels on highlight. In this simple example, that even saves you a line. Cool. But in a real project, you can lose track of what tile actually is. A size, a color. That becomes a problem if you assign red to the variable. The layout breaks. Red isn't a length, so the browser can't render those tiles anymore. That wouldn't happen with property. You can declare exactly what your variable is. I declare property tile and then define a syntax. That can be a color, percentage, URL, integer, lots of options. In our case, we choose length. I can also specify whether the property inherits and set an initial value. Here I set 200 pixels. And the layout, as you can see, fixes itself. The highlight tiles are back because red isn't a valid assignment for a variable that must be a length, so the tiles fall back to the initial value of 200 pixels. In the end, I simply assign 300 pixels to tile again and get the layout I want. And now you can see what CSS Houdini is about. It gives you access to the CSS object model and lets you tell the browser how to parse properties, all straight from your CSS file. That's the new bit. CSS Houdini provides you a bunch of APIs and also a lot of JavaScript methods that let you extend CSS basically. And with property, this has real benefits. It enables things you couldn't easily do with CSS before, like animatable gradients. Here's how it used to be. The left box represents the old world. We have a linear gradient from blue to purple, and on hover we want to push the stop further back. But because the browser passes gradient declarations as strings, it couldn't interpolate between the original and the new state. No smooth animation possible. Now you can tell the browser that a property called stop holds a percentage. When you set a different percentage on hover, the browser understands it and can animate smoothly between, say, 20% and 60%. Very cool. So that's what I mean. Property is definitely a nerdy feature, but it also brings real value. On we go. I like JavaScript, but I also like it when I can build things with just HTML and CSS and don't need any JavaScript for it. And the exclusive Accordion fits that bill perfectly. HTML has the element summary and details. With them you can, as you can see here, expand and collapse content. And if you use several details elements in a row, you end up with a classic web layout pattern, the accordion. So far, so good. What you often want with an accordion though is that as soon as one item opens, the others close. Until 2024, you couldn't really avoid JavaScript for that. Now there's the exclusive accordion, and it's about as simple as it gets. All you have to do is give all related details elements the same name attribute. Then all modern browsers understand, okay, you open one section, I'll close another. Nice feature. One thing to note in my example, I created custom plus and minus symbols for the summary elements via the markup pseudo class. Unfortunately, this detail isn't completely supported in Safari yet. But I really recommend taking a look at HTML accordions. This here is a really nice example of what you can achieve with them. I've linked it for you below. I have to admit, I've used this quite a few times and didn't even realize it wasn't in baseline yet, but it is now. Backdrop filter. Especially now that liquid glass is the #1 topic in UI design, it's really fun to play with filters, like the blur effect here. And you can do it purely with CSS. Backdrop filter, blur 3 pixels for example. There's a little bit of JavaScript here too, but only for the parallax effect, because I think the liquid glass look comes through better when the background moves. The button's enlargement is also just CSS. Backdrop filters make the most sense when you place elements on top of an image. There you can apply effects to the layers underneath, change brightness and contrast, increase grayscale, and so on. I've listed all the effects for you in another code pen. Backdrop filters are simply practical and stylish. Often you no longer need to edit the original images, you can manipulate them like this instead. And now all major browsers support it without any polyfills. You have probably seen this before. Instead of a classic URL fragment with just a hash where you jump to the element with that ID, you've been able for a few years now to reference text fragments as well. To do that, you append colon, tilde, colon, text equals, followed by the text the browser should jump to and ideally highlight. And that's where the target text pseudo element comes in. It lets you style the highlighted text typically by setting a background color and a text color that fit your layout. Very handy. But note that you can't style everything with it. For example, you can't change the font size, which makes sense. I've linked a Mozilla page for you to play around with this. It's also a great place to test how text fragments work. For example, you don't have to pass the entire text in the URL. You can provide the start and end separated by a comma. Even more complex things are possible. Check it out if you're interested. I've also linked the documentation. This next feature made me think, wow, that solves a problem. A small problem, if you're honest, but if you spend a lot of time with CSS, you tend to care about details. It solves a problem that's basically always existed, at least on Windows machines. And it's kind of absurd that only now there's a nice solution for all devices. So what it is about? If you have an area that's scrollable, then at least on some devices, the scroll bar itself takes up space, and that steals a bit of space from the child elements. That's exactly what you can fix with scrollbar-gutter. Or at least you can avoid a layout jump. If you set it to stable, the browser will always reserve space for the scroll bar, even if it's not visible yet. That way you avoid layout shifts that can just look messy. Otherwise, an element like this box here jumps around depending on whether there's a scroll bar or not. This only affects classic scroll bars though. With overlay scroll bars, for example on macOS, you won't notice a difference because the scroll bar sits on top of the content instead of taking up space. In addition to scrollbar-gutter, Baseline now also includes the ability to set the scrollbar width to thin or none, and the scrollbar behaves accordingly. Feel free to play around with it in my CodePen. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Tell me in the comments whether you found it helpful or which other topics you would be interested in. I would also really appreciate a like or a subscription, and that helps me a lot in producing these videos. Thank you so much and see you next time.